The job was supposed to be simple. Survey tags read clean, no sentience, low atmospheric hazard, mineral signatures dense enough to make corporates smile. My job? Confirm the asset, rig the extraction, and walk away with a bonus large enough to stop checking my account balance every morning. I had done this 16 times before on 12 different worlds, and the worst I had dealt with was a basalt shelf that cracked under load and sent half a drilling platform into a canyon. No one died. The gear was insured. I got paid. This one was going to be different. I could feel it in the way the ground sat under my boots, off enough that my brain kept trying to name the problem and coming up empty. We touched down 3 hours past local dawn on a plain the color of rust and old blood. The lifter's engines kicked up a cloud of fine red dust that settled fast, too fast, like the ground was hungry for it. I stepped off the ramp first, because that is what loadmasters do. You test the ground before you trust it with your crew. The surface held. It gave maybe half a centimeter under my weight, then firmed up. Not rock or sand. Something in between, fibrous and dense, like compressed peat that had been baked dry. 50 meters ahead, the teeth started. They rose out of the plain in a line that stretched to both horizons, each one the height of a 5-story building, smooth and white and banded with layers of translucent material that caught the light like frosted glass. I had seen the orbital images, but images do not prepare you for scale. These were not fossils. They did not look old. They looked dormant, the way a machine looks when it is powered down, but not broken. Jax! Judith Quinn's voice cut through the comm, sharp and nasal. She was still on the ramp, tablet in hand, running her pre-deployment checklist. Judith was corporate's oversight on this run. A woman in her 40s who had never touched a rigging harness, but could quote contract clauses faster than I could tie a bowline. She wore a grey jumpsuit with the company patch stitched over her heart, clean boots, and the kind of expression that said she had 3 meetings after this one, and you were already making her late. Confirm visual on primary asset. I am looking at about 200 primary assets, I said. Which one do you want? The largest accessible specimen within transport parameters. You know this. I did know it. I was stalling because part of me, the part that had spent 6 years learning when to walk away from bad weight, did not like the way the bases of those teeth disappeared into the substrate. They did not sit on top of the ground. They went into it, roots and all, like they were anchored in something that had give. Deke Hollis stepped up beside me, his boots crunching through the thin crust of dust. Deke was my senior rigger, a man in his late 50s with scar tissue on his forearms from an acid spill in his 20s, and a way of looking at a problem that made you trust his answer. He tilted his head at the teeth, squinting against the light. You seeing what I am seeing? Depends. What are you seeing? They do not look dead. Petrified, I said. Survey called them fossils. Survey called them safe to move. Deke spat into the dust. Survey also said the substrate was granite composite. You feel granite under your feet? I did not. I felt something that moved when I shifted my weight, just barely, just enough to make my ankles work to stay level. Judith descended the ramp and joined us, her tablet screen throwing pale blue light across her face. The mineralogical survey tagged this site as low-risk extraction, petrified biological structures embedded in stable sedimentary rock. Unless you have conflicting data, Moreno, I suggest we proceed with the asset selection. I glanced at Deke. He shrugged. We had flown 6 weeks to get here, burned half our operational budget on fuel, and corporate had already drafted the press statement about pioneering mineral recovery on uncharted worlds. Walking away now would cost me the bonus, the reputation, and probably the next 3 contracts. I had done riskier pulls. I had worked under worse ground. I pointed to a tooth near the center of the visible field, isolated from its neighbors by about 30 meters on all sides. It stood taller than most of the others, maybe 18 meters from base to tip, with clean bands of enamel running vertically along its surface. White fading to pale yellow, fading to a grey that looked almost blue in the right light. The tip was blunt, worn flat, like something had been grinding against it. "That one," I said. "Good spacing for anchor placement. Dense enough to justify the haul. If we can crack it free and get it topside, corporate can build a conference room out of it." Judith made a note on her tablet. "Confirmed. Primary asset designated. Ground team will conduct proximity survey and structural analysis. Rigging begins at 1400 hours local." Deke muttered something under his breath that I did not catch, but I knew the tone. It was the sound a man makes when he agrees to a job he does not like but cannot articulate why. We walked the field for 2 hours, threading between the teeth like tourists in a sculpture garden designed by something that did not understand proportion. Up close, the structures were worse. Each one had texture. Fine vertical striations, microscopic pitting, faint ridges that ran horizontal across the enamel bands like growth rings in a tree. I touched one with my glove and felt resistance, smooth but not slick, slightly warm from the sun. When I rapped my knuckles against it, the sound came back solid and deep, the way stone rings when there is mass behind it. But the bases were wrong. Every tooth disappeared into the red substrate without a clean seam, like they had grown there instead of fallen. I crouched next to one and scraped away loose material with my knife. Underneath, the substrate was fibrous, packed tight, more like dense muscle tissue than rock. It gave when I pressed the blade in, then firmed up again when I pulled it out. No crumbling, no fracture lines, just flecks. Deke crouched beside me and ran his hand over the surface. His fingers left shallow divots that filled back in over the span of 3 or 4 seconds. "This is gum tissue." "What?" "Gum tissue. Like in your mouth. Healed over, maybe calcified. But look at the structure. You ever see sedimentary rock move like that?" I had not. I also had not seen gum tissue the size of a parking lot, so I was willing to table the observation under weird geology and move on. Survey would have flagged biological contamination. Survey flagged mineral deposits and called it safe. Deke stood, wiping his hand on his thigh. "I am just saying, this is not granite." Judith joined us with Elise Hart, trailing a few steps behind. Elise was our systems analyst, a woman in her early 30s with short dark hair, calm hands, and the kind of brain that could track 40 data streams without breaking focus. She carried a portable scanner rig strapped to her forearm and was already pulling up the terrain maps from her survey drones. "Initial mapping complete," she said, her voice even and factual. "The tooth structures form a spiraling pattern extending approximately 800 kilometers in all directions from our landing site. Spacing is irregular but consistent with radial symmetry. The trenches between them are between 6 and 12 meters deep, following the same spiral geometry." "Trenches?" I asked. Elise turned the scanner so I could see the display. The map showed the plane from above, a massive spiral of white dots, teeth, separated by dark lines that curved and intersected like the grooves in a fingerprint. The substrate dips between each structure. My drones registered thermal differentials along the trench lines, warmer toward the center of the spiral, cooler at the perimeter. I stared at the map. 800 kilometers. That was not a field, that was a continent. Judith leaned in, squinting at the display. "Geothermal activity?" "Possibly," Elise said. "Or residual heat from decay processes in deeper layers. I will need more data to confirm." "Log it as a secondary observation," Judith said. "Primary asset confirmation takes priority." I turned back to our target tooth, standing alone in its little clearing of red substrate. The spacing was good. The structure looked stable. I could sink grav anchors, compact plates that increase local mass and deploy microteens to bite into substrate. At 4 points around the base, run the spreader bar, a ceramic crossbeam for balancing lift loads, up the center, and have the spindle winch pulling weight by sunset. Clean extraction, simple physics, the kind of job I had built my reputation on. Deke was still looking at the ground, his jaw tight. "How deep do the roots go?" "Deep enough to matter," I said. "But we are not pulling the root. We crack the tooth free at the base, lift it intact, and let corporate worry about the rest." "And if the base does not crack? Then we pull harder." Deke gave me a look that said he had worked with me long enough to know when I was pushing, and this was one of those times. He did not argue. He just nodded and walked back toward the lifter to start prepping the rigging gear. I stayed in the field a little longer, standing in the shadow of the tooth I had chosen. The sun was higher now, and the light hit the enamel bands at an angle that made them glow from the inside, pale and cold and beautiful. I counted the cost in my head: fuel, crew wages, equipment rental, insurance premiums, Judith's oversight fee. If we pulled this tooth and delivered it intact, the bonus would clear 18 months of debt and buy me enough breathing room to be selective about the next contract. If we failed, I would spend the next year taking trash jobs in station salvage yards, pulling wrecked hulls apart with plasma torches for a daily rate. I had failed before. 3 years ago, on a dry dock platform in the Kepler Annex, a support frame collapsed while I was running cables through the scaffolding. The whole structure twisted, and 3 workers ended up pinned under a section of hull plating. I cut the suspension line that would have brought the rest of the frame down on me and climbed out. I went back in twice and pulled 2 people free. The third was too deep, the frame too unstable, and by the time the emergency crew arrived with cutting torches, he was gone. The safety board cleared me. They said I made the right call. They said cutting that line saved 5 other people on the same rig. I still saw his face when I closed my eyes at night. I still felt the weight of that line in my hand, the moment the blade went through the braided core and the tension released. I told myself this job was different. This job was clean. No people trapped under failing steel, no tough choices. Just a tooth, a winch, and a lift. I told myself I was going to get it right this time. By 1400 hours, we had base camp set up on a ridge overlooking the tooth field. The ridge gave us 20 meters of elevation and a clear sight line to the target. Elise parked her drone station at the edge, running continuous mapping sweeps while the rest of us hauled gear down the slope. The lifter sat behind us, engines cool, external rigging rails prepped for cargo lockdown. I walked the anchor points with Deke, marking positions in the substrate with spray paint, 4 cardinal points around the tooth, each one far enough out to distribute load, but close enough to keep the pull angle tight. Deke knelt at the first mark and drove a test spike into the ground. It went in smooth for the first 30 centimeters, then hit resistance. He twisted, pushed, and felt it sink another 10 before locking. "Stable enough," he said. "But if this stuff starts to soften, we lose bite." "It will hold," I said, because I needed it to hold. We deployed the grav anchors, metal discs the size of dinner plates, each one studded with emitters that increased localized mass when activated. Deke placed them with the care of a man who had seen anchors fail, checking the seating angle twice before locking them in. I ran the cables myself, threading high-tensile fluoropolymer-sheathed braided steel from each anchor to the central spreader bar I had positioned against the tooth's base. The spreader kept the pull even, distributing force across 4 points instead of concentrating it at one. It was the difference between cracking a tooth free and snapping it in half. The spindle winch, our primary lifting tool, sat 30 meters upslope, bolted to a reinforced platform. It was a drum the size of a cargo barrel with smart brakes and enough torque to lift a dropship if you asked it nicely. I tested the spool, watched the cable feed smooth, and locked the controls to my wrist-mounted interface. Haptic feedback hummed against my skin. Everything felt right. Judith descended from the ridge with her tablet, checking off items on her pre-extraction list. "Asset rigging complete. Anchors set, cable run, winch armed," I said. "We will do a load test at 1600 to confirm bite, then stage the lifter for primary extraction tomorrow at dawn. Clean window, No weather. Good light. Corporate wants live telemetry during the pull. They can have it. Elise will uplink the whole thing. Judith made a note, then looked past me at the tooth field. Her expression was hard to read, but I caught the faint tightness around her eyes. You are confident in the structural integrity. Confident enough to stake my license on it. She nodded and walked back up the ridge without another word. Deke stood beside me, arms crossed, staring at the target tooth. You ever pull something this big? Once. Hab module on Drexler 4, 40-meter cylinder, half buried in permafrost. We had to thaw the ground with heat lances before we could get cables under it. Did it work? We got it out. Took 3 days and the client complained about the fuel cost, but we got it out. This does not feel like permafrost. No, I admitted. It does not. We worked through the afternoon, tightening connections, checking splice points, running safety protocols. The younger crew, 2 riggers named Callum and Yates, handled the secondary lines, threading backup cables through the anchor grid in case the primary load shifted. I taught them the old rule. Always run a safety line you do not plan to use, because the day you need it, you will not have time to string it. At 16:30, the ground moved. It was a slow, undeniable rise and fall, like the plane had taken a breath. Loose stones rolled toward the trenches. Dust lifted and resettled. The tooth did not move, but I felt the substrate flex under my boots, a give that should not have been there. Everyone stopped. Callum looked at me. Yates looked at Deke. Elise up on the ridge was already pulling seismic data from her scanners. Equipment check, I said, keeping my voice level. Anchors, cables, winch. Confirm load integrity. Deke moved first, kneeling to inspect the nearest anchor. It sat flush, no shift, no tilt. The cable tension read nominal. He moved to the next one, then the next. All stable. I checked the winch housing myself, running my hand over the frame, feeling for stress fractures or loose bolts. Everything was solid. Elise called down from the ridge. Seismic sensors read 0 ground displacement. No tectonic activity, no subsurface movement. If it moved, it was a slow surface flexion the seismics don't register. Then what was that? Yates asked. Thermal settling, Judith said, her voice flat and certain. Substrate cooling after solar exposure. It happens on low-atmosphere worlds. I had been on low-atmosphere worlds. I had felt thermal settling. That was not what this was. But I did not have a better explanation, and the crew was looking at me like they wanted one. So I gave them the same thing Judith had given me. Certainty I did not feel. Thermal settling. Log it and move on. We finish the rigging, run the load test and call it a day. Deke gave me that look again. The one that said he knew I was lying, but would back me anyway. We finished the rigging as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the tooth field in shades of orange and red that made the structures look like they were lit from within. I ran the load test at 1700 hours, pulling just enough tension to confirm the anchors were biting. The cable sang, the winch hummed, and the tooth shifted maybe 2 millimeters before I backed off the torque. Good enough. We would do the real pull at dawn, when the ground was cold and the crew was rested. I walked back toward the ridge as the light failed, my boots kicking up red dust that hung in the air longer than it should. Halfway up the slope, I stopped and looked back at the trenches between the teeth. There was moisture in one of them. I walked back down, slower this time. The trench was maybe 8 meters wide and twice as deep, its walls smooth and slightly concave. At the bottom, a thin film of clear liquid pooled in the center, maybe 2 centimeters deep, catching the last light of the sun. I crouched at the edge and reached down, dipping 2 fingers into the liquid. It was cold, colder than the air, and viscous, thicker than water, but thinner than oil. It clung to my glove without soaking in, beading on the surface like it did not want to mix. The suit's fluoropolymer outer layer is built to shrug off solvents and acids. I stood and wiped my hand on my thigh. The bead skittered and held, slick and unmoving, but it didn't bite into the fabric. Elise was already deploying a drone before I called for one. The small aerial unit descended into the trench, its rotors kicking up faint spray as it skimmed the surface of the liquid. It hovered, extended a sampling probe, and retracted. Then it climbed back toward the ridge. It made it halfway before the hull started to corrode. I watched through the drone's camera feed on Elise's scanner. The plating around the probe port was pitting, metal flaking away in thin curls that peeled back like skin. The rotors stuttered. The drone listed, overcorrected, and barely made it to the ridge before Elise grounded it manually. She knelt beside the drone, running her fingers over the damaged hull. Where the liquid had touched, the metal was gone, dissolved, leaving rough edges and exposed circuitry. Contact time was 30 seconds, she said quietly. The corrosion is still active. I looked back at the trench. What had been a small pool was now a shallow stream creeping along the trench bottom, moving toward the center of the spiral. Deke stood beside me, his arms crossed. We should abort. We are not aborting. We have one window. We pull the tooth tomorrow morning, lock it to the lifter, and dust off before the next thermal event. That is the job. That is not thermal settling. I know. I turned to face him, keeping my voice low enough that the rest of the crew could not hear. I know it is not. But we are here, the rigging is done, and corporate has already logged this as a viable extraction. If we walk away now, we eat the cost and spend the next year digging through station scrap. I am not doing that. Deke looked at me for a long time, his jaw working like he was chewing through the words he wanted to say. Finally, he nodded. One window. If the ground shifts again, we cut the load and lift out. No argument. Agreed. He walked back toward the camp, and I stayed at the edge of the trench, watching the liquid spread. It moved slow, almost lazy, filling the channel with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. I told myself it was runoff, subsurface moisture, working its way to the surface, a natural process we just did not understand yet. I told myself we would be gone before it mattered. I told myself a lot of things that night. Dawn came cold and still. I stood at the edge of the ridge with a ration pack I was not eating, watching the tooth field resolve from shadow into pale morning light. The liquid in the trenches had spread overnight. What had been isolated pools now formed connected channels, glassy and smooth, threading between the teeth like veins. I counted 17 separate flows from where I stood. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, I stopped counting. Deke joined me, his breath misting in the chill. He did not say anything. He just looked at the field, then at me, then back at the field. We run the extraction at 1400 hours, I said. Clean pull, no delays. If the ground holds, it will hold. He did not argue. He walked back toward the gear cache to prep the final rigging, and I stayed where I was, watching the light change. The teeth caught it first, those translucent bands glowing faint gold, then white, then settling into the same bone-pale color they had been yesterday. Beautiful. Wrong. Both. At 06:15, the ground moved. It started as pressure against the soles of my boots, a slow upward push that made my knees flex to stay balanced. Then the whole plane rose with the same rhythm as a chest expanding on an inhale. The substrate lifted maybe 10 centimeters, held for 3 seconds, and settled. Loose stones that had been sitting on flat ground rolled toward the trenches. A coil of spare cable I had left near the winch platform slid half a meter before stopping. The tooth did not move, but the trenches deepened. Walls that had been smooth yesterday now showed faint horizontal lines, like the tissue had compressed and released. I felt it through my bones. Not the motion itself, but the certainty of it, the way you know a machine is running, even when you cannot see the engine. Elise was already at her scanner station, pulling data. I climbed the ridge and stood behind her, watching the display populate with topographic overlays and motion tracking. Ground displacement measured at 9.2 centimeters. Uniform across the surveyed area. Duration, 87 seconds. Seismic sensors still read zero tectonic activity. Thermal settling does not displace ground uniformly, I said. No, it does not. She tapped the screen, bringing up a timeline graph. First event logged at 16:30 yesterday. Second event at 06:15 today. Interval 13 hours, 45 minutes. If the pattern holds, the next cycle should occur around 2000 hours tonight. Should. The interval could shorten. She pulled up a secondary display showing temperature gradients across the field. The trenches were warmer than the surrounding substrate by 2 degrees. The center of the spiral, 800 kilometers away according to her mapping, registered 4 degrees higher. There is a heat source. It is active and it is spreading. Judith appeared beside us, tablet in hand. Analyst Hart's preliminary data suggests biological processes rather than geological. Biological processes in what? I asked. In the substrate, the teeth, the entire structure. Elise zoomed in on a cross-section scan of the nearest trench. The walls showed layered density consistent with tissue, fibers running perpendicular to the surface, compression bands where the material had flexed and healed. This is not sedimentary rock, it is collagen matrix, calcified, dormant, but organic in origin. Dormancy and calcification would have masked standard biohazard flags on a quick orbital pass. I stared at the scan. Collagen, gum tissue. Deke had called it yesterday, and I had filed it under weird geology because the alternative was too large to fit in my head. Judith tapped her tablet, pulling up contract specifications. Corporate requires asset confirmation and extraction within the operational window. Current environmental volatility does not exceed acceptable risk parameters for high-value recovery. We are standing on something alive, Elise said quietly. We are standing on an uncharted geological formation exhibiting unusual thermal and structural properties, Judith corrected. Corporate will want samples and analysis. The primary asset remains viable. I looked at the tooth field, at the trenches filling with liquid, at the substrate that had just breathed. Viable. We had flown 6 weeks. We had burned the fuel. Corporate had the press statement drafted. Walking away now meant I ate the cost and spent the next year pulling trash. Or I could finish the job in the next 4 hours and walk away with the bonus. We extract during the low phase, I said. Crew works in shifts. No one stays on the ground longer than 2 minutes. We pull the tooth, lock it to the lifter, and lift before 1900 hours. If the ground shifts again before then, we abort. Deke, who had been standing at the base of the ridge, called up. And if it shifts while we are rigged, then we cut the load and climb. He did not look satisfied, but he nodded. Judith made a note. Elise saved her data and closed the scanner display without comment. I walked back down to the winch platform and started the pre-extraction checks, running my hands over every connection point, every shackle, every splice. The cable was good. The anchors were seated. The tooth was still standing exactly where it had been yesterday, white and clean and worth more than I had made in the last 3 years combined. I could do this. I had done harder pulls on worse ground. I just needed the ground to stay still for 4 hours. By midday, every trench held liquid. It came up from below, seeping through the substrate like groundwater finding its level, but too fast and too uniform to be natural seepage. I watched it rise, 1 centimeter, then 2, then 5, while the crew ran final rigging checks. The channels that had been dry yesterday now held streams that moved with the slow, deliberate current of something being pushed rather than flowing. I sent another drone down. Elise piloted it from the ridge, bringing it low over the widest trench near our position. The drone descended to within a meter of the liquid surface, extended its sampling probe, and dipped. Contact time, 6 seconds. When Elise pulled it back, the probe was gone. The housing where it had been attached was pitted and weeping thin trails of corroded metal. The drone made it back to the ridge, but the rotors were unbalanced. one of them missing half its leading edge. Deke walked down to the trench with a long-handled ladle, ceramic composite, rated for industrial solvents, and scooped out half a litre of liquid. He set it on a flat section of substrate, and we watched. The ladle lasted 90 seconds. The liquid sat calm and clear in the bowl. Then the ceramic began to soften, like the molecular bonds were coming undone from the inside. The bowl sagged, the handle drooped, and within 2 minutes the whole thing collapsed into a puddle of grey slurry that the liquid absorbed without changing colour. Deke pulled a piece of boot rubber from his pack, a replacement sole, thick and flexible, and dropped it into a shallow pool at the edge of the trench. We timed it. 2 minutes before the rubber started to break down. 3 minutes before it dissolved completely. He looked at me. "We are wearing boots. We step in that, we have 3 minutes before we lose the sole. You still want to do this?" I looked at the tooth. 18 meters tall, maybe 80 tons, worth 18 months of breathing room and the reputation that came with tough pulls. Then I looked at the trenches, at the liquid rising slow and patient, at the substrate that had breathed this morning and would breathe again tonight. The math was simple. We had 7 hours until the next cycle. The extraction would take 3 hours. 1 to activate the winch and break the tooth free, 1 to secure it to the lifter's external rack, 1 for final lockdown and liftoff. That left 4 hours of buffer. Plenty of time. As long as the cycle did not come early, as long as the liquid did not rise faster, as long as the substrate stayed solid. I had made calls like this before. I had weighed risk against reward, crew safety against contract obligations, and walked the line between caution and cowardice. Most of the time, I got it right. The one time I did not, a man died, and I spent 3 years trying to balance the ledger. This was different. This was a clean pull. No one was trapped. No one was pinned. I could abort at any point and walk away. But walking away meant I had flown 6 weeks for nothing. It meant corporate logged me as unreliable. It meant the next 3 contracts went to someone else. It meant I kept checking my account balance every morning and wondering when the floor would drop out. "We go," I said. "Crew works in pairs, 2-minute rotations. No one stays on the ground if the liquid reaches boot level. Lifter stages overhead with the ladder deployed. If the ground shifts, we climb. No debate." Deke turned and walked back toward the crew. I heard him giving orders. Calm, clear, no argument. And I knew he would keep them safe even if I was wrong. I just had to not be wrong. At 1400 hours, I activated the winch. The cable pulled taut, the spreader bar groaned, and the anchors bit into the substrate with a sound like slow tearing. The tooth shifted, barely, maybe half a centimeter, and I backed off the torque, letting the load settle. The anchors held. The cable sang, tension radiating up the line into the drum. I increased torque by 5%, feeling the resistance through the haptic interface on my wrist. The tooth moved again, another centimeter, and this time I felt the substrate give underneath, flexing, like I was pulling against something that had stretch. I signaled Callum and Yates, who were stationed at the base of the tooth with pry bars and hydraulic jacks, tools for widening the gap once the tooth started to lift. They moved in, wedging the bars into the seam where the tooth met the substrate, and levered. The substrate split. It parted. A clean separation. Fibrous edges pulling apart like dense fabric under tension. The split ran horizontal around the base of the tooth, and as it widened, I saw the layers underneath. Red tissue, compressed and dry, with thin white striations running through it like tendon. Deeper still. Something that looked wet, glossy, slick, alive. Callum stepped back. "Jacks, this is not rock." "Keep the jacks in place. I am increasing load." I pulled the torque up another 10%. The winch drum turned, the cable tightened, and the tooth tilted. 1 degree, then 2. The substrate around the base peeled back in sections, layers of red tissue folding away from the root like petals opening. The root itself was smooth and white, tapered to a blunt point, and it went down farther than I had expected, at least 3 meters into the substrate before disappearing into tissue I could not see. The ground breathed, not the long, slow rise from this morning. This was shorter, sharper, a quick flex that made my knees buckle and sent loose stones tumbling into the trenches. The tooth lurched, tilting another 5 degrees, and one of the grav anchors whined, a high, keening sound that meant it was losing bite. I killed the winch, and the cable went slack. Elise's voice came through the comm. Second cycle event. Displacement, 12 centimeters. Duration, 41 seconds. Interval from first event, 7 hours, 52 minutes. 7 hours, not 13. The cycles were accelerating. I looked at the tooth, canted at an angle, root half exposed, substrate peeling back around it like a wound that would not close. Then I looked at the trenches. The liquid had risen another 3 centimeters. It was moving faster now, currents forming, surface tension breaking into small ripples that spread and merged. Judith's voice cut through the comm. "Moreno, status on asset extraction. Tooth is destabilizing. Substrate integrity is compromised. Requesting abort authorization. Corporate requires asset confirmation. Continue extraction." I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it. Corporate was not here. Corporate was not standing on ground that breathed. Corporate was watching telemetry from a boardroom 6 weeks away and making decisions based on contract clauses and profit margins. But corporate was also the reason I had a job, the reason I could pay my crew, the reason I had spent 3 years chasing winds large enough to quiet the noise. I increased the winch torque. The cable pulled, the tooth tilted, and the substrate split wider. The root came free in stages, sections of tissue tearing away as the tooth levered out of the ground. I heard it, felt it, a wet, fibrous sound that traveled through the substrate and into my boots. The tooth leaned further, past 20 degrees, past 30, and the grav anchors started to slide. Callum and Yates scrambled back, boots kicking up red dust as they cleared the pull zone. The tooth hung suspended for 3 seconds, root fully exposed, tissue hanging in ragged strips from its base. Then the ground breathed again. This time it was not a flex. It was a contraction, a deliberate muscular pull that drew the trenches deeper and sent the liquid surging. The substrate around the tooth collapsed inward, and the whole structure tilted past 45 degrees, dragging 2 anchors with it. The cable screamed, the winch frame shuddered. I killed the torque and hit the emergency release, but the tooth was already falling. It hit the ground on its side with a sound like a building coming down, and the impact sent a wave through the substrate that I felt in my chest. The liquid in the nearest trench surged over the edge, spreading fast, a thin, glassy sheet that climbed towards the crew. "Ladder!" I shouted. "Now!" Deke was already moving, waving Callum and Yates toward the ridge. The lifter's engines spun up, the pilot bringing it low, the emergency ladder dropping from the belly hatch. I ran for the winch, hitting the retract command, pulling the cable back up and away from the liquid. The drum spooled fast, the cable whipping through the air, and I clipped it to the platform frame before sprinting for the ridge. The liquid reached the base of the slope. I watched it spread, and I knew we were not going to make another extraction window. We were out of time. The tooth lay on its side like a felled tree, root exposed and weeping liquid into the spreading pool. I stood at the top of the ridge with the crew behind me and the lifter overhead, engines holding steady, waiting for orders I was not ready to give. 18 months of debt, 3 years of ledger balancing, all of it lying in a trench filling with acid. "We are done," Deke said. He was not asking. I looked at the tooth. The enamel was intact. The structure was solid. It had fallen, but it had not broken. If I could get cables under it, drag it to higher ground, use the lifter's mag clamps to secure it for transport. "Jacks!" Deke stepped closer, his voice dropping. "We are done." I turned to Elise. "How long until the next cycle?" She checked her scanner. "Estimated 43 minutes, but the intervals are collapsing. The next one could come in 20. Or 10. Liquid depth in the target zone. 15 centimeters and rising. current rate of increase is 3 centimeters every 8 minutes. I did the math. In 40 minutes, the liquid would be at knee height. In an hour, waist deep. I looked at the tooth again, at the prize that was supposed to clear 18 months and buy me breathing room, and I made a choice I had made before. We rig for drag extraction, I said. 2-person team, fast placement. Spread a bar under the tooth, cables to the lifter's primary clamps. We pull it horizontal, clear the liquid zone, and lock it topside. 30 minutes, in and out. Judith's voice came through the comm, tight and clipped. Corporate advises immediate evacuation. Asset loss is acceptable under current risk parameters. Corporate is not here. Moreno, I switched her to secondary channel and looked at my crew. Callum and Yates, young and eager and stupid enough to trust me. Deke, who had worked with me long enough to know what I was doing and why. Elise, calm and factual and already calculating the odds. I need 2 volunteers, I said. Fast rigging, no safety margin. If the ground shifts, you climb. If the liquid reaches your boots, you climb. No argument. Callum raised his hand. Yates followed. Deke looked at me like I had just volunteered to cut another line, and maybe I had. We went down in the lifter, using the belly hatch and the deployed ladder to descend into the field. The liquid had spread beyond the trenches now, a thin, glassy sheet that covered the substrate in irregular patches, pooling in depressions, flowing toward the spiral center. I stepped off the ladder onto dry ground and felt the substrate give under my weight. Softer than yesterday, spongier, like the collagen matrix was losing cohesion. Callum and Yates followed, each carrying a section of spreader bar. I had the cable spool clipped to my harness, 300 meters of braided steel that I would thread under the tooth and up to the lifter's mag clamps. Simple job, basic rigging. The kind of work I could do in my sleep. Except the ground was breathing, the liquid was rising, and my boots left shallow prints that filled with moisture as I walked. We reached the tooth in 3 minutes. Up close, it was worse. The root was still weeping liquid that beaded on the white surface and dripped into the pool below. The enamel bands were intact, but the base where the root had torn free showed ragged tissue, red and fibrous, hanging in strips. I touched it with my glove and it came away slick. "Spread a bar under the root," I said. "Callum, you take the far side. Yates, hold the cable while I thread." They moved. I unspooled cable, feeding it under the tooth's midsection, pulling it through the gap between the enamel and the substrate. The tooth weighed 80 tons, maybe more, and the substrate underneath was soft enough that dragging it would carve a furrow. But if I distributed the load across 3 attachment points, balanced the pull angle, kept the cable tight, the ground flexed. A tremor, a quick rise and settle that made the tooth shift and press down. Yates, who was standing in a shallow depression to keep the cable from tangling, stumbled. His boot broke through the substrate crust and sank into liquid underneath. He pulled his foot out fast, boot sole steaming, thin trails of vapor rising where the liquid had touched. "I am fine," he said, but his voice was tight. I checked the sole. The rubber was pitted, surface layer gone, but the structural weave underneath was intact. 30 seconds of contact, maybe less. He had 60 seconds left before the boot failed completely. "Get to the ladder," I said. "I can finish." "Ladder. Now." He climbed. Callum and I finished threading the cable alone, looping it twice around the tooth, securing it with triple-lock carabiners rated for twice the load I was pulling. I signaled the lifter pilot. The mag clamps engaged, the cable pulled taut, and the tooth shifted. It moved maybe a meter before the substrate underneath liquefied. The tooth did not drag. It sank. The root end dipped into the pooling liquid, the enamel bands tilted, and the whole structure started to roll. I hit the emergency release on the cable and dove back, Callum right behind me, as 80 tons of calcified tissue rolled onto its side and displaced a wave of liquid that climbed halfway to my knees before I could backpedal. My boots hissed. I felt heat through the soles, not burning, but close, a warning that I had seconds before the rubber failed. Callum was already running for the ladder, and I followed, each step leaving a boot print that filled and dissolved behind me. I made it 10 meters before the ground breathed again. This time it was not a flex, it was a contraction, a long, sustained pull that drew the trenches deeper and sent the liquid surging in waves that merged and spread. The substrate rippled, and I felt it through my legs. The tooth I had been trying to drag rolled again, this time into a trench, and disappeared beneath a glassy surface that closed over it like a mouth swallowing. I ran. The ladder was 15 meters ahead. Deke was leaning out of the hatch, one hand on the frame, the other reaching down. I grabbed the lowest rung and pulled myself up, boots leaving rubber streaks on the metal, gloves smoking from where I had braced against substrate that was no longer solid. Callum was already inside. Yates was strapping into a jump seat, his boot on the deck beside him, sole eaten through to the inner lining. Elise was at the scanner station, her hands on the controls. "Cycles are collapsing," she said. "Interval between last two events, 9 minutes. The substrate is losing structural integrity across the surveyed area. We have..." She stopped, recalculating. "We have maybe 20 minutes before the entire field is submerged." I looked out the hatch at the tooth field. The trenches were rivers now, liquid flowing fast, surface tension breaking into currents that spiraled toward the center. And the teeth. The teeth were moving. Each one shifted in place, grinding against its neighbors with a sound like stone on stone, a low rhythmic scrape that I felt in my chest. They were not scattered. They were arrayed, interlocking, and as the substrate contracted, they compressed together, edges meeting, surfaces grinding. I understood. The trenches were the spaces between grinding surfaces. The liquid was digestive fluid. The substrate was tissue. And the teeth were functional. We were standing inside a mouth. "Pilot," I said, "how many can we carry on the external ladder?" "Rated for 6. Emergency override extends to 8. There are 7 of us. I can carry 8 if the load is balanced and we do not pull high G maneuvers." I looked at the field, at the liquid climbing, the substrate collapsing, the teeth grinding in synchronized motion. Then I looked at my crew, Callum and Yates, watching me like I had answers, Elise running her numbers and already knowing what they meant, Judith standing near the rear hatch with her tablet, Deke beside me at the open hatch waiting. "There are 3 more crew at the ridge camp," Deke said quietly. "Cargo handlers. They were staging equipment for secondary extraction. 3 more. That made 10. The ladder held 8. I looked out at the tooth, my tooth, the prize, the payday, half submerged now. Enamel bands disappearing beneath liquid that bubbled and churned. Corporate wanted proof of asset. Corporate wanted mass they could measure from orbit. Corporate wanted me to deliver, and I had flown 6 weeks and burned the fuel and staked my reputation on making this pull work. But corporate was not here. Corporate was not choosing who climbed and who waited. Corporate was not holding the line. I was. 3 years ago, I cut a cable to save myself and climbed out of a collapsing dock, while a man I could not reach died underneath steel I could not move. The board cleared me. They said I made the right call. They said cutting that line saved 5 other people. I never believed them. I spent 3 years trying to balance the ledger, chasing pulls large enough to prove I was worth more than the weight I carried. I told myself redemption came in tonnage. I told myself winning big would make the numbers line up. I was wrong. Redemption does not come from cargo. It comes from who you carry home. I turned to the pilot. "Hard burn to the ridge camp. We extract all personnel, then clear Atmo, no secondary runs." The asset stays." Judith stepped forward. "Corporate requires, corporate can send another crew." I looked at her. "We are leaving. Now." She stared at me, then closed her tablet. She did not argue. I grabbed the cable spool from my harness and clipped it to the lifter's internal anchor point. The spindle winch was still on the ridge, bolted to its platform, cable retracted and ready. If I could reach it, I could use it to pull people. "Elise," I said, "how stable is the ridge?" She checked her scanner. Substrate integrity is higher at elevation, but degradation is spreading. Estimated 15 minutes before the camp zone becomes unstable. 15 minutes. I could work with 15 minutes. The lifter climbed, engines straining, and I watched the field drop away beneath us. The teeth were grinding faster now, spiraling motion visible from altitude, surfaces sliding against each other in synchronized rhythm. The trenches overflowed, liquid spreading in sheets, and at the center of the spiral, I saw it. A hole, a throat, dark and contracting, opening and closing with the same rhythm as the ground's breathing. We reached the ridge in 4 minutes. The 3 cargo handlers were already at the edge, gear abandoned, watching the field collapse. I leaned out of the hatch and shouted, "Everyone on the ladder, 2 at a time, move!" They moved. The first 2 clipped on and started climbing, while I ran for the winch platform. The frame was shaking, grav plates losing purchase as the substrate underneath softened, but the drum was intact, and the cable was still spooled. I hit the release and watched the cable drop, 300 meters of braided steel uncoiling into the field below. Deke reached the platform behind me. "What are you doing?" "Rigging a ferry. If the ground goes while they are climbing, I can haul them up faster than they can move on their own. You will rip them off the ladder. Then I will haul them up gentle." The ground breathed again, long and deep, a sustained contraction that dropped the ridge by 20 centimeters and sent equipment sliding toward the edge. The winch platform tilted. I threw my weight against the frame, boots carving ruts in softening substrate, and held the anchor in place while the last cargo handler clipped onto the ladder. The cable pulled. The frame shuddered. I felt the grav plate slipping, mass lock failing, and I knew I had seconds before the whole rig went over. "Deke," I said. "Ladder." He did not argue. He climbed. The last handler reached the hatch. I let go of the winch frame and sprinted for the ladder, boots leaving prints that collapsed behind me. I grabbed the lowest rung and pulled myself up hand over hand, the lifter already rising, engines redlining as the pilot fought to gain altitude. Below me, the winch platform slid, tipped, and fell into the field. The cable snapped free, the drum tumbling, and within seconds the liquid covered it completely. I climbed, the ladder swayed, the lifter bucked in convection currents rising from the surface, and I did not look down until Deke's hand locked around my wrist and hauled me through the hatch. The crew was strapped in, silent, steam rising from their gear. Yates had his boot in his lap, sole gone, inner lining charred. Callum's gloves were pitted, fingertips showing through where the material had dissolved. Judith sat near the rear bulkhead, tablet closed, staring at the deck. I watched through the viewport as the field flexed one more time. The teeth ground together, surfaces sliding, wearing, compressing. The liquid overflowed the trenches and spread in sheets that merged into a single, churning pool. And at the center, the throat opened wide. The tooth I had cut loose, my tooth, the prize, was gone, dissolved, broken down, indistinguishable from the hundreds of others that lay scattered across the grinding surface. Elise broke the silence. "We are clear of the atmosphere," the pilot called back. "Jump plotted. Ready on your command." I looked at my crew. I counted heads. 10 people. Everyone I had brought down. Everyone I was responsible for. The number was right. For the first time in 3 years, the number was right. "Jump," I said. The stars bent, and the mouth fell away behind us. 2 years later, I stood in a training facility on Ganymede Station, watching a crew of 6 rookies rig a practice extraction on a mock cargo platform. They were young, eager, and making mistakes I had made 20 years ago. Anchor spacing too narrow, cable angles wrong, one of them trying to muscle a spreader bar into position instead of using the leverage point. I let them work through it. That was the job now, safety instruction and risk assessment for colonial recovery operations. I taught people how to read ground, how to trust equipment, and when to walk away. The pay was steady. The hours were predictable. No one asked me to chase tough pulls or stake my license on bad weight. Corporate had buried the incident report from the unnamed world. They classified the coordinates, flagged the sector as a navigational hazard, and paid out the crew bonuses for extreme operational duress. Judith got promoted. Elise moved to deep survey analysis, tracking thermal signatures on uncharted worlds. Deke retired. Last I heard, he was running a rigging supply shop on Europa, selling the same gear he used to trust his life to. I took the teaching contract because I was tired of counting tonnage. The rookies finally got the spreader bar positioned correctly. I walked over and checked their anchor placement, running my hand along each connection point the way Deke had taught me. "Anchors look good," I said, "but your cable angle is off by 12 degrees. You pull at that angle, the load shifts left and you lose half your lifting power." The crew lead, a woman named Torres with sharp eyes and scarred hands, recalculated and adjusted. She did not argue. She just fixed it. "Better," I said. "Now show me your abort protocol. I want to see how fast you can drop the load and clear the zone." They ran through it, quick, efficient, no hesitation. When Torres hit the emergency release and the practice load dropped clean, I nodded. "Good. That is the move that saves lives. Remember it." After the session, I filed my evaluation and walked to the observation deck. Ganymede hung below, ice and rock and human ambition carved into its surface. Safe, mapped, known. I thought about the tooth sometimes, the prize I had cut loose. 18 months of debt I had carried for 2 more years before clearing it with salary instead of bonuses. It had taken longer, it had been harder, but everyone came home. I pulled up the incident file on my tablet. Not the sanitized version corporate released, but the raw telemetry Elise had flagged before they classified it. The coordinates were still there, the thermal signature, the spiral pattern that covered 800 kilometers, and buried in the survey data, a note in Elise's precise handwriting. "Archival search shows 4 prior expeditions to this sector. No return telemetry. Last contact logged 4 weeks before surface operations. 4 crews, 4 loads of people who had read the same survey data, followed the same corporate tags, and landed on the same ground I had. None of them had cut the cable in time." I closed the file and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the mouth was still feeding. The teeth were still grinding. And someday another crew would read a clean survey, see high-value mineral signatures, and touch down on rust-colored ground that gave just a little too much under their boots. I could not stop that. I could not flag every bad pull or teach every crew to walk away when the numbers stopped adding up. But I could teach them to count what mattered. I could teach them that sometimes the only win is getting everyone on the ladder. And maybe, when they stood at the edge with the prize in front of them and the ground starting to shift, they would remember the choice I made and make the same one. Not because it paid better, because some ledgers do not balance with weight. They balance with names.